Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Mary Murphy, who is a professor of psychology and brain science at the University of Indiana, also affiliated with Stanford at the Center for Advanced Study, and the CEO of a company called Equity Accelerator. And not only that, of course, she somehow finds time to write this book, Cultures of Growth, How the New Science of Mindset Can Transform Individuals, Teams, and Organizations. Welcome, Mary.
Thank you, Greg. I'm really excited to be here.
You know, I think it's probably fairly well known, this whole idea of growth mindset versus fixed mindset, at least among the people that I hang out with. This has become so pervasive, at least the lingo. I mean, it's kind of like psychological safety. It's something that everybody says, not everybody completely understands, but even the people who do understand it, they have this view of it that it's something that is up to the individual.
That's right.
Individuals are supposed to figure out how to, get their mindset right. And I think in the book you said it's a little bit ironic that, we have this sort of almost essentialist view of different types of mindset as if they are ingrained. And I think what you're trying to do with this book and your work in general is to emphasize the extent to which the environment, the culture, the people you spend time with and the organizations that you work for can impact profoundly the mindset that you have. And, I like this. You said something which I thought was really profound. I hadn't really ever articulated in quite this way. And you said every gathering of people has a mindset.
Has a mindset culture for sure. Yes.
Exactly. Has a mindset culture. So anyway, I mean, maybe you could talk just a bit about, I think it was in grad school that you kind of came up with this insight about the external influencers or variables that can impact mindset.
Yes. I love this idea, and the data sort of bear it out that when two or more people are together, there's a mindset culture. You can see that, I think, a lot in families, for example, when, if you have a family like I grew up with siblings, there's that sibling who's good at school. There's this sibling who's good at sports. There's that sibling who's good at arts and creativity, right? And so we have these silos. We put each other in these boxes, and then we only do activities related to those things. It's kind of like our strengths finders in the workplace. And that then creates who we think we are. That's like more of a fixed mindset culture, even though we don't mean it to be that way. It really kind of sets us up to think about ourselves and each other that way. You're right that this idea kind of came to me in grad school. I can tell you a little bit about that story. Carol Dweck, who is the founder of the idea of mindset from the late 1970s. She had just arrived from Columbia to Stanford, where I was a PhD student. And I was in my third year of the PhD program. And every year, like many PhD programs, every student has to present to their local faculty in their area within the psychology department. And so I was sitting in there in a seminar room, supporting a friend of mine who was in their fourth year of the PhD, and he was up there presenting his research, and he's in the middle of it, and then all of a sudden on the right-hand side of the room, there is this professor, and it was a he, who just blurts out in the middle of it, like, well, it's clear the fatal flaw in all of this work is XYZ, and he goes on and on to pontificate on it, and my friend looks at him and tries to engage, and then as he's just getting, some momentum there and engaging this faculty member, on the other side of the room, another professor blurts out, no, the problem isn't XYZ, the problem is ABC. And suddenly these two professors are fighting amongst each other to see who's the biggest gorilla in the room, who's the smartest person, who can take down my friend and his ideas, the quickest. And I saw what it did to my friend, right? My friend in the moment froze a little bit, even though he knew his work forwards and backwards. And I thought, this is really something's going on here culturally around this experience in this seminar, because I contrasted it with the other seminars I had been seeing in different parts of the department, where we basically saw that, yes, the faculty were engaging in the student talks and pointing out the problems and the mistakes that they were making with regards to their thinking or their logic. But they were, instead of fighting to see who was the smartest person in the room, they were arguing amongst each other to figure out how to best improve the project. Actually, think about this measure, or think about this other population you might include, or think about this other theory that really seems to predict some of the things that you're working on. And so the students leave those two environments very differently. My friend was so impacted by that experience that he decided to change his entire PhD trajectory to not focus on that particular question because of that experience, right? He left demotivated, didn't want to touch his work for weeks, and ultimately changed pathways, which extended his time in the PhD. In the other seminar, the more growth minded seminar, I saw students leaving. Yes, they were like, disappointed that there were some problems in their work or in their thinking, but they had 5 or 6 or 7 different solutions or strategies that they could go today at the end of the seminar and go try to see if it actually would improve their work and take it to the next level. And so I started thinking about these two environments. One is like your theory is sink or swim, you're only as good as your last performance, that sort of fixed mindset idea. And the other one was really about growth and development is something we do together. And I was thinking about this and I thought, this is like theories of motivation. Who do we have on faculty who think about theories of motivation? Carol Dweck. So I walk down to her office and I knock on her door and I say, Carol, I know that mindset has mostly been studied as a quality of our minds. What's your mindset? How does it affect you? What's my mindset? How does it affect me? Is there any way, has anyone ever thought about mindset as a cultural feature, as a feature in the environment that actually shapes the way everybody is responding to each other and to work and performance in these environments? And she looked at me and she smiled and she was like, no, Mare, no one's ever thought about it that way. We should do that work together. So that was in my 4th year that we started really getting into that work in the PhD program. And we've collaborated ever since. And my students and many other folks in the field have actually started to look at mindset as culture and not just mindset in our heads.
Yeah, I mean, you create this dichotomy between the culture of genius and right, and the culture of growth. And there are a whole lot of other things that seem to line up with this dichotomy, right? And we can get into that later, explore and exploit and so forth. But, I found it interesting. You made this reference to Joseph Addison, right? Way back in the 18th century, who said there's 2 types of genius, right? There's, natural genius and learned genius. And so should we be talking about the culture of natural genius and the culture of learned genius instead of, I mean,
Yeah,
would
I
that be
mean,
one?
well, and the question for me is whether genius is even the goal. In the way in which we think about genius, yes, like there's that old view of genius as sort of you're just born with it, right? It's natural, just comes to you. It's the spark of insight, and we know that that's largely a myth in terms of how creativity and innovation actually happens. But when we think about growth mindset culture, I wonder whether or not, like, even learn genius. Is genius the actual thing we want to achieve? Or do we want to achieve like continuous learning and improvement and development and always being at the cutting edge of what we're doing? I'm not sure if that qualifies in our stereotype or prototype of what a genius is, but I certainly think it's more indicative of what a culture of growth is.
Well, now in the book, I mean, you highlight all of the failings of this culture of genius, and you talk about how a growth culture, which people can identify fairly readily, right? Even before they take a job or join an organization, you can sometimes tell. But you talk about how collaboration and innovation and integrity and all these things seem to be better in the culture of growth. So it makes me wonder, I mean, I'm an economist, and so I'm all about trade-offs. And so I'm always thinking, there's no way this thing could persist, this culture of genius, unless it also had some strengths, right? I mean, how could you possibly have so many organizations that are run according to this? And I was wondering, you also point out that there's high turnover. So and I think you were implying that the high turnover is a consequence of the culture of genius. But I mean, could it go both ways? I mean, could it be that, when you do have high turnover, you just simply don't have time to grow and develop your employees, and so you kind of got to take them as they are? You know, Is there something to like the short term versus the long term mindset?
Yeah, yeah. I do think that it can be a recursive cycle. Like what you're suggesting is a more of a recursive cycle. We do see from some of the studies where we've actually helped organizations or teams or in classrooms, faculty members create more strong cultures of growth in their classroom. And then we look at motivation, engagement, and we look at in organizations, we look at not only engagement, disengagement, burnout, but also retention over time within these teams. And we do see an impact that when we change some of these, we see better outcomes. So I do think it works in that direction for sure. But I also think that it's very possible that in environments that have high turnover, just as a function of its industry, for example, you might also want to fall into the trap, I think is the better way I would say it. You might fall into the trap of thinking that you don't have time to develop people. You don't have time to really grow individuals. And so we have to be sure that the people we bring in are of highest intelligence, ability, talent, that sort of thing. I think that this is a little bit of a false dichotomy because it's not that the culture of growth doesn't want high performers. I think that one thing I teach when I teach this idea in classrooms is I teach it as a 2x2. There's performance on one dimension, let's say on the X, and then there's mindset culture on the Y. Everybody wants the people in the high performer context, part of the 2x2. But what people really want, the question is, do you want those high performers to have more of a fixed mindset about their high performance, their skills and their talent and their ability? They say, oh no, this is the thing that I really excel at. And I don't really want to go beyond that thing because then that leaves me vulnerable. I'm going to make some mistakes. I'm not going to be as good, that sort of thing. Or do you want those high performers to also have a growth mindset about their strong abilities, that they're willing to try new things, work in new ways? I mean, right now at this age of AI, if we don't have people with growth mindsets about their skills and abilities and what they can actually learn and the case studies they can develop for its use, I don't think we're going to get great performance when it comes to the use of these kinds of technologies in the workplace.
Yeah, I mean, I think at some place you mentioned that, fear impedes innovation, but it seems like also, high discount rates, like a sense of urgency. I mean, a lot of people talk about how, organizations need to have a sense of urgency in order to address the changing world. But it seems like if you allow that sense of urgency to short circuit development and growth, right? It's ultimately going to be counterproductive. So how does one have a sense of urgency and importance while at the same time understand that it takes time to develop and cultivate and grow both people and ideas?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we see that really distinguishes strong cultures of growth from the more strong, fixed-minded cultures of genius is that in strong cultures of growth, they have learning systems in place where they're actually much more rigorous when it comes to collecting data, using data, not having data siloed in various areas where there's only these are the people who get the data and they're the only ones and you have to ask them and it takes 3 months for them to give to a report of what you've asked for. In cultures of growth, they're much more tuned to tracking where everyone is and the work and output that they're doing. They focus on performance and high performance. Whereas in a strong culture of genius, what we see is that a lot of times you see these huge swings with regards to what our focus is going to be, what our strategy is going to be. And it often depends on the gut of the resident genius at the moment, right? What does this particular CEO want in this moment? And 3 months later, they may want something totally different. And so we all have to align that way. And we're not actually tracking the data to see whether or not those decisions or that effort that we're putting in or the strategy that we're pursuing is actually having impact on the goals that we want to be achieving. And so I think that when we think about how do you actually do this in practice when it comes to knowing that it takes some time with people, with process, is you have to be able to have learning systems to track that. And you also have to have systems that make it possible for everyone, regardless of their role, regardless of where they sit in the hierarchy within an organization, to be able to share ideas about innovation, about ways of working, about the kinds of strategies that we might take up, and then to be able to find ways to lift those ideas up to the people who might be able to implement or decide about them. And what I see is that in strong cultures of growth, you have those kinds of learning systems. Where we are in the moment, they're more accurate, right? Where they know who needs more development and who doesn't, who needs a stretch assignment, who doesn't. And they also have ways of lifting information from the bottom up, so that good ideas can come from everywhere and be used across the organization.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like there's some misconceptions about what we call culture of growth, right? Some people think that you're referring to kind of a soft, right, organizational culture without like strong demands. And the people who would defend the organizations that you characterize as culture of genius, I guess General Electric under Jack Welch is a great example, or Microsoft under Steve Ballmer. I mean, a lot of people would say, no, 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 like these are organizations that take metrics seriously. These are organizations that have, they're demanding, that are rigorous, that use internal competition to, you know, get the best out of their people. I mean, to what extent? I mean, how could people be wrong about that? I mean, why do people think that these cultures of genius are, um, you know, destined to outperform and that they're more rigorous and so
Yeah.
forth?
Yeah. I think that we have this belief, especially in Western societies, around meritocracy. And we have this belief about being able to stack people's abilities and then be able to make decisions about who belongs and who doesn't belong based on where they land in the stacked ranking, right? And so we know that stack ranking came up under Jack Welch and at GE. That's one of the enduring legacies of some of his leadership and management principles. And I will say that we have noticed that in this moment, tech companies are starting to take on more and more stack ranking, even though they'd gotten rid of it prior. This is making a comeback. And when we think about these kinds of policies and practices, think about what it is communicating about the core beliefs about talent and intelligence and ability in those environments. What we're saying when we sort of stack everyone up and we sort of, but first of all, you have to believe that the way in which you're stacking is legitimate, that you know how to measure people's talent, skill, and abilities across functions and across teams. And then the question is then, what do you do with that? In very strong cultures of genius, what you do is you take out the bottom 20% or the bottom 15% or the bottom 10% and you fire them and then you start again for the next quarter. And what does that do to people internally? It communicates, look to your left, look to your right, only a couple you're going to be here at the end of the year, right? And so you start to get this competition inside these teams, inside these organizations that actually inhibit creativity, inhibit innovation, right? I'm not actually willing to give my best ideas out there to the team because I don't want someone else to take advantage of them. I don't want someone else to claim them as theirs. You see people not being willing to take intellectual risks because if that risk doesn't pay off, it'll be taken as a sign of low skill or ability, and I will risk my ranking in the organization. And so we see a lot of that in these strong cultures of genius. Why do they persist? I think that they persist because they align with some of our beliefs about meritocracy, maintaining the status quo. I think that we like to think that, there is some deep-seated skill, talent, ability, and that we can understand what that is in people, and then we can rank people by it, and we can then make choices. I think all of those things are complicated when you actually look at the social science and the behavioral science around this as to whether we do understand what those things are and how to rank people. In a culture of growth, it's not that you wouldn't know where people stand with regards to their ranking in an organization, but instead of dropping the bottom 10, 20%, you might drop some really low performers because, again, cultures of growth want high performers. You want excellence in those environments. But you're also going to give credit and give strategies, resources to people who take on those stretch assignments, to people who do take intellectual risks, to people who do share their best ideas, because that's the kind of thing that's actually going to help the whole team grow, develop, and be more successful as a whole. So those are the things that's kind of different in the ways in which we see people use that kind of metric.
Yeah, it seems like the problem is not with ranking per se, right? I mean, every organization is going to have some way of evaluating people, and it's going to ultimately result in some kind of ranking. So the problem is really with the kind of rank and yank, right? Because it seems like the whole rank and yank concept is built on the notion that there's a fixed pie, right? And so the fixed mindset seems to line up with this kind of fixed pie mentality, right? I mean, I think there was a quote that I forget who it was you quoted. You said, if you had Satya Nadella and you know Jeff Bezos and Steve Jobs, all on
All
your
on the
team,
same
you'd
team.
have to fire one of them, right?
That's right. That's right. Exactly. Exactly.
And so, I mean, that seems to be an insight that we see in negotiations a lot, right? So, and we teach negotiations, we talk about how you need to imagine that there is a pie that is not fixed, that can grow, right? And so maybe talk about how does that line up with growth mindset, right? The idea that you can build value and you don't need to necessarily reallocate value.
Absolutely. This aligns really well. I think that a lot of times our default is to not only be thinking about the pie as fixed, but also really having a lot of self focus. What is my portion of the pie, right? And when we do that, we're trying to think about, okay, got to elbow people out. I got to make sure that I get what's mine in this fixed pie context. And so that really sets up our team, our collaborators as competitors rather than people that will work together, that we can trust, that we can actually build something going forward. And so it actually further narrows your vision. You're thinking about just performance goals rather than also learning goals and process goals, right? And when we think about the pie, when we think about negotiation, the pie as something we can build on, we do that together, right? It's not something that's just for myself. I'm also thinking about the needs as we do in negotiation. We think about what the needs are that are around us, not only my needs, but also the needs of the person I'm negotiating with. And then we use that to build the pie more fully. And when we do that, we are more likely to be able to meet our own needs and the needs of others. And so I think that that's one of the ways in which mindset intersects with this idea of negotiation is the self versus other kind of focus that the fixed mindset, fixed pie view really focuses us on the self. And this view of the pie as something that's expandable, something we can build together, really helps us think about it as more of a team endeavor, something that we're doing together. And we know that when we can get adversaries to collaborate towards a goal, you're more likely to be able to get some kind of consensus solution that meets the needs of everybody involved.
Yeah, and so in other words, your coworkers are not the people who are, your enemies.
That's
Right?
right. That's right. Absolutely. They shouldn't be, right? I mean, especially if you're going to have to think about negotiation as a repeat player game, right? In these kinds of negotiations, we know that's different from the one-time shot negotiation, but in the repeat player game, to think about if you're always going to have to compete against this person over and over, you negotiate very differently than if you know that this is someone who, you're going to trust, you're going to be able to build something together over time. You're able to come together on solutions very differently. And in the real world, in the workplace, right, these are going to be repeat players that you're going to be interacting with over and over.
Well, I mean, the thing about culture though is that it's very sticky. I mean, it's kind of hard to change a culture, which is why I'm just fascinated by the Microsoft story. And I mean, I'm doing a case. I'm teaching the Microsoft case in class right next week, and so I'm going to get some inside intel from you here because everyone points to the old Microsoft as a fixed mindset place, and when Satya Nadella came in, I mean, he completely changed the culture. I mean, how does one do that? Like, I still am a little puzzled on how one can come in and, we had a big cultural initiative here at the Haas School of Business, but the way it was formulated was kind of like, hey, we're going to identify elements of our culture and then we're going to articulate them. And that seems to be a little bit of a different exercise from saying we're going to rip this thing out root and branch and we're going to put something new in. And then, outsiders would say something like, oh, no, like this is just a shift from exploit to explore. And when you're in exploit mode, then it makes perfect sense to have the old culture. And then when you want to do explore, then you have to move to this other culture. So I guess two questions in one.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think the story of Satya and Microsoft is a really good one because it also shows the nonlinearity of building a culture over time. And this is something that Satya himself has written about in his book, and other people have written about it. His chief people officer and many others, Kathleen Hogan and others, have written and spoken about it. But I will say that, for those who are less familiar with the case, Satya comes in and he kind of does a tour of the whole company and listens to different directors and listens to what's going on and what their strategy is. And after this, he was in a press conference and a journalist asked him, "Hey, what's it like to be at Microsoft these days?" And he pointed to this cartoon that had these executives sitting around a conference table and they all had guns pointing to each other, right? And so that was the culture he inherited, one that was like rife with this internal competition. And everybody was just, it was stagnant. People were not really offering any kind of creative or innovative solutions. And he'd inherited this kind of older, approach to technology that had really set Microsoft back over time. And so he thought about this and he said, okay, he read Carol's book. I think it was his wife who provided the book to him. And he thought, I wonder if this growth mindset thing could happen in an organization and not just in the head. So he had this insight way before I did as a graduate student. And he said, let's give it a try. And so he used it as a framework. And then what he specifically did, he kind of assigned in some ways some of this to Kathleen, who as people officer said, okay, how do we recruit in a way for this kind of idea of growth mindset around people willing to grow, develop, to get beyond their comfort zone, to really push this way? How do we change the culture inside? What would we have to differently incentivize when it came to performance reviews and evaluation? And now Microsoft does things like many other organizations now have done, where they ask you in your performance evaluation, yes, you have to meet your metrics, your key results that you are supposed to be responsible for, but you also have to list who was most essential to helping you develop or grow or achieve an outcome this quarter. And then also, who did you help? And they can do some really interesting network analysis and matching there to really see who are the builders of this culture, who's really helping others achieve their goals. And you could see how they contribute to various kinds of key results, right? So they shifted some of the performance evaluation, the bottom line metrics that really motivate people's behavior on the ground. That was one thing they did. Then they also, beyond the people process, Satya also decided to take a look at all of these different parts of the organization, and he'd applied growth mindset to his strategic investment decisions. So he looked at the company and he said, okay, there's these areas we're going to have to probably shut down this, we're going to shut down that, but I'm going to invest in 3 or 4 areas of the company and I'm going to double down on them. And I know not all of them are going to be successful, but we are going to put in place learning systems so that whatever mistakes are made, whatever doesn't work out, we're going to be able to get all of that learning and communicate it to the entire organization so we learn quicker and we actually are able to further our strategy more quickly as well, more effectively. And from that, one of those investments was cloud computing. And he really doubled down in that area. And there were some really high profile mistakes, right? In that building of that. And yet he used those mistakes really to help support the rest of the strategy and making sure that that part and the other parts of the organization were learning from that, using that learning and not making those same mistakes again. So he got much more quick and more effective at wresting that learning from mistakes and challenges that they were having. Another thing I will say is that when you first, as a leader, sort of lay down, we're going to go ahead and change the culture here, and it's going to have this framework and this sort of thing. There can oftentimes be, in the same way that there were the guns around the table when he first arrived, suddenly there's still guns around the table, but now they're loaded with growth mindset. Now it's like, who's the most growth minded of our directors and our senior VPs and these others? And they say, oh, Satya, invest in me. I have the true growth mindset. That guy over there, they have like a false growth, fake growth mindset, right? They're a fixed mindset.
And they had to yank some of those people,
That's right.
right?
That's right. And so it's not like you had to get very specific about what growth mindset is, what are the behaviors on the ground and the norms and the practices that they really wanted to see, because otherwise it just became yet another label that they would use to fight amongst each other. And so, as I say, it's not a linear journey, and it's one that you really have to commit to, and you have to also be learning as you are developing that culture over time. What's working, what's not working, what needs more explanation or examples or this sort of thing. How do you tell the story? I mean, CEOs and other senior leaders are chief storytellers, and how they tell the story about what matters and how to be successful here really helps shape some of those cultural narratives that people then use to guide their own behavior on the ground.
Yeah, but what's the relationship between the individual mindset and the mindset culture? I mean, if you take a bunch of people who have a growth mindset, they're coming from an education that has created this mindset, and you slap them together. I mean, are you just going to organically get a growth mindset in that culture? I mean, if you have a culture of growth mindset and you recruit some people who come in with fixed mindset, are they going to are they going to flip? I mean, do they have to flip? I mean, could you have people with fixed mindset who act as if,
They have a
they have
growth
culture
mindset,
mindset?
yeah, in those
Yeah.
environments. Yep. These are great questions. So I do think that, let me tell you, Greg, the story that actually showed me as a researcher in this area for years why mindset culture was especially critical to be paying attention to above and beyond individual mindset. So to your first question about the relationship between these mindset cultures and individual mindset. So this was a study that we did in the context of education. We did this with high school teachers and high school students starting their high school journey, so first year high school students. And what we did was we created a program that taught students, these first year high school students, freshmen, about the growth mindset and what the growth mindset is, what does it look like in practice as you're learning, what's the neuroscience behind it around plasticity and the development and connectivity of neurons as you are putting in effective effort, as you're learning, as you're trying new things, as you're learning from mistakes. And we created this program. We delivered it in a randomized controlled trial kind of methodology, experimental methodology, to more than 12,000 first year high school students. And they either got the mindset program or they got a control program about good learning strategies that didn't have anything to do with mindset. And we wanted to see if it would have impact on two outcomes. One was GPA. Would it actually have an impact? Learning about the growth mindset, does it over time impact performance, which would be a replication of previous research? Would it actually positively impact performance? The second was intellectual risk-taking. So in high school curriculum, STEM courses, and especially advanced STEM courses after algebra in high school, tend to be the most difficult or rigorous courses if we think about difficulty and rigor. And so we wanted to see whether students would actually take more of these difficult courses if they had the growth mindset program. And what the results showed was indeed we saw an impact on GPA. We also saw an impact on intellectual risk taking, but we actually found two places where it didn't work. We looked at heterogeneity in these analyses, and we found two places. One was teachers. When teachers did not have a growth mindset and did not engage in growth mindset practices, when they had more fixed mindset beliefs for their students, and they engaged in more of these fixed mindset teaching practices, students learning about the growth mindset, it had statistically zero impact on their GPA or their intellectual risk taking. It was only in the context where they had teachers who themselves had more growth mindset for their students and engaged in these practices that students were able to use that newly formed growth mindset and actually make it real in their own learning environment. They had opportunities to learn, opportunities to try again, opportunities to grow. Not so in the fixed mindset classroom context. The second place it didn't work was when instructors and teachers had not paid attention to the peer culture. And so when it was uncool in that classroom to try new things, to make a mistake, to raise your hand and not necessarily have the perfect answer, or to seem excited about learning in that environment, when that was the case, learning about the growth mindset at the individual level for students had no impact on their outcomes. It was only when the instructor had created a culture in that peer environment where everyone was excited about learning. No one was going to leave anyone behind in that learning and development, right? There was it was celebrated when you made a mistake, because that actually helped us understand where you understood things and where you didn't. And so this is the study to me. It was a huge RCT, a huge experiment across the country. And we kind of saw that you could have the most growth-minded person, but if they're in a fixed-minded culture of genius, they're not going to be able to use or benefit from their personal growth mindset. And so I do think that we see over and over again, we've done this in experiments, we've done this in field studies, in actual companies and organizations, that mindset culture can actually trump an individual's personal mindset, because the policies, the structures, the ways of behaving are so tuned to what the local culture is, what the microculture is on that team or in that particular classroom.
Yeah, and you referenced another study about teachers giving feedback to students, right? And some tiny intervention around how they expressed expectations, and it seems remarkable to me how much expectations influence behavior, right? And I have a lecture that I give to my students a lot where I talk about um, complaint culture versus idea culture, and how if the difference between a complaint and an idea is entirely up to you as the listener, right? And if you treat it like a complaint, then the people become complainers. If you treat them like ideas, then they become idea generators. So, I mean, as a leader, it seems, and even as a peer and as a colleague, it seems like you start with the assumption, right? The expectation that the people you're interacting with are capable of growth. But then you also have to somehow communicate this. So how does one kind of communicate it that one believes that someone is capable of growth?
Yeah. Well, I think that if you are in a position of leadership and you have, say, direct reports in an organizational context, I think, and this is true, we actually see it in K-12 all the way through college settings as well, that people really appreciate when the leader in the environment sees their growth and development and shows it back to them. So you know this if you have had kids, kids love to learn about what they were like as babies and how far they have come, right? They love, remember when you didn't even know how to tie your shoe? Like, remember how, you weren't even sure how to, you didn't like broccoli then, now you love broccoli, whatever it might be. They like to show and think about their own growth and development. So too, and as adults in the workplace setting, if we can create relationships where we can actually show employees and our direct reports, individual contributors, where you have seen their growth and development, appreciate that, mirror it for them. It puts them themselves in that growth mindset so that they're then willing to try something new, to continue to push, to continue to develop, either in that area or in a new area that's required in the moment. And so I think that's one thing that we can do pretty easily, is to just be that mirror for process and for growth and for development for people, and be able to help people reflect on that for themselves, because where you've been, it can be predictive of where you're going to go, right? And so I think that that's one thing that people can do pretty easily.
Yeah, I mean, I think for people like myself who are strong believers in growth mindset, and I think it probably for me goes all the way back to when I was a kid and Montessori school and so forth. Like, um, for me, I just take it for granted, and I assume that everybody thinks this way, which of course is completely incorrect. And so when I give feedback and I say, "Oh, here's the problem with your paper," like it for many years, it never even occurred to me that someone would deflect that or ignore that. Yeah, and it's like, well, wait, I'm like, I don't have to do this. Like, I'm doing this, and people they feel hurt, they feel uncomfortable, they don't like it, and so I guess it's important, even if you are a strong believer in growth mindset, it's not that obvious,
That's
right,
right.
to other people.
That's right. That's right. And we talk about this in the sense of people's different kinds of mindset triggers. So we came up with these 4 mindset triggers, which are really situations or situational interactions that happen between people that really we see from the literature. If you kind of do a meta-analysis of the literature and look at the different experimental and field studies and say, where are the places that people either move to their fixed or their growth mindset more frequently? And critical feedback is one of those that's a real strong fixed mindset trigger for a lot of people. That and evaluative situations where we anticipate being evaluated by others. And so we're really putting together our presentation or writing our report or writing our paper, really trying to think, what does this person want? I want to be sure I make an A. I want to be sure I come off, as smart, intelligent, as like, the best in the room. And so all of that shapes the way we do that work or, the performance. And so those, knowing what people's mindset triggers are likely to be, we can then give them some feedback or put them and ask them to accomplish this evaluative situation in a way that actually sets that concern about what do you believe about my talent, my intelligence, my skills, my abilities. Put that to bed. Say things like, listen, I know wise feedback is really helpful here. So wise feedback is a whole process that has a whole lot of research behind it, where the gist of it is that someone who's providing feedback says, listen, I have really high standards for your performance here, but given the past and what I've seen and what I know about you, I believe that you can meet those standards. And so let me tell you about how I think we need to go about it so that you can meet those standards and go beyond those standards. And so what you're doing there, why does that work so well? It actually helps put to bed that fixed mindset, because I'm telling you that I believe in your talent. I believe in your skills and abilities. And that's the only reason I'm giving you this critical feedback, because I want you to be able to go and meet these standards and go beyond them. And so, knowing that I'm interacting with a student who has a really strong fixed mindset trigger around critical feedback. They don't like it. They shirk it at all points, right? They get disengaged every time I give it. Those are the kinds of reassurances that can help so that they can take that feedback and know that it's not about them. It's actually about the work and about improving it because you believe that they have the ability to grow and improve.
Yeah, and I feel like our job as university instructors is to, prepare students for a world where the folks giving the feedback might not be as,
As psychologically
as,
attuned. That's right.
as right. And so,
That's right.
regardless of how it comes in, if you have the right mindset, you can spin it in a way where it's useful no matter what, right?
That's right. That's right. To be able to see feedback as a gift, as something that someone wouldn't even give you if they didn't believe that you could develop, grow, and get better. Because if they didn't think you could do that, why would they even spend their time, right, giving you that kind of feedback? So helping people understand that at an earlier stage in their education so they can then use that kind of lens for it in the workplace and later on, I think is invaluable for students.
Now, granted, it's not always the case. I mean,
That's
they might
right.
just
That's
be,
right. That's
they,
right.
they
But
might
nine
just
times
be
out of
jerks.
10, people are not going to give you critical feedback unless they think that you can do something about it.
hmm Now, you had a great section in there on the relationship between effort and ability. I think this really gets to the heart, I think, of the growth mindset. And there are some people that believe that these things are positively correlated, and others have a different view. And it seems like, I don't know, there are certain educational settings where people are looking for effortless learning. I mean, I try to tell my students I'm teaching MBA students, and I said, look, if you're uncomfortable, like that's a good thing. but but oftentimes, if you create a little discomfort, it can come back and hurt you as an instructor or as a leader, particularly on your feedback. Like, this guy made me uncomfortable. So I mean, it seems like if I don't offer up a bit of a lecture ahead of time explaining and justifying the purpose of whatever discomfort they're experiencing, then they're going to misunderstand it. So how do we get people comfortable with the right kind of discomfort?
Yeah, I think this is especially, there's also cultural variability in this around the world as to the extent to which we endorse a positive or a negative correlation belief between effort and ability. So, particularly in the West, we see a lot of people really believing in this negative correlation. If I have to try hard, if I have to put forth all this kind of effort, maybe this isn't for me. Maybe this isn't something that quote unquote naturally comes to me. Maybe it's not worth doing. And we have seen this as I've worked in many different organizations now. We've seen this a lot, and this is what people will say. And I don't know if it's true. I don't know if the data is actually there, but a lot of leaders will say, oh, this next generation, Gen Z and the younger generation, they really think that things should just come easy. And they're not used to sort of having to persist and have to overcome challenges and that sort of thing. And so they say, oh, maybe that's just not for me. I'm just going to try this other thing. I'm going to pivot over here. I'm going to pivot over there. And they're just looking for the easy, effortless kind of behavior. And leaders find this endlessly frustrating. And that's really a fixed minded belief, right? And high effort situations are often people's fixed mindset trigger that we talk about in the book. If I have to try hard, maybe I'm not cut out for this. And so what the growth mindset culture does, and what we do when we are creating growth mindset learning environments or working environments in companies, is that we're really trying to reframe that relationship between effort and ability, pointing out, telling stories, showing people, having them do self-reflection on where did they make the most progress, right? Where do you actually see the best outcomes coming? Is it always effortless, or have there been challenges that have been overcome and strategies that had to be pivoted and teams that had to come together, right? So illuminating the process of success helps people understand whether or not effort is what's required for ability, required for high success, right? And strong success and excellence. And so being able to reframe it that way, even everybody has some story, their own personal story of where they've had to try hard, they got some breakthrough, and suddenly they were able to do something or have some kind of outcome that they were really going for. So reframing even at the individual level but also at the cultural level and at the team level and at the company level, telling those kinds of stories helps kind of dispel that otherwise fixed-minded belief that effort and ability are negatively correlated.
Yeah, I would love to see data on this. I mean, I talked to Gene Twenge about, generational differences, and I don't think that we have good data on this. Um, but, it would be worrisome if we were creating, you know, a generation of people who had fixed mindset, because that's not what we're saying out loud. But I mean, it turns out that everything is pretty darn easy. I mean, everything on your phone is designed for one click, not five clicks. And I was just I was just using a healthcare app the other day, and I was like super frustrated because I was trying to figure out when's my appointment, and I couldn't do it in one click, and I was just like
So
cursing.
frustrating. Yeah. And many people would give up, right? Like, well, forget it. I'll just get a phone call or a text message or something.
And sometimes, when I talk to some of my young people that I know, I'll say, "Oh, hey, can you go, fix this?" And they're like, "Well, I don't know anything about fixing it." And it's like, "Well, I don't know either, but I could look it up on YouTube, right?" So, even looking stuff on YouTube seems like a challenge sometimes. But I think you had some point about playing to strengths and finding your passions. And I like this because, if we go back to where we started, it's not about, discovering your genius as much as it is sort of creating your genius, right? Shaping your genius. Is that true for passions too? I mean, you create your passions rather than discover your passions?
Yeah. I mean, I'm critical of things like strengths finders and a lot of this focus on passion, follow your passion, as if your passion just kind of exists in some innate, the way you were born, what you got interested in, kind of being blind to the way we actually develop passion. And what I'll say is that it's not necessarily that these practices, which are extremely popular in the workplace, are bad, but it's the way in which we think about them. So a lot of the strengths finders, it depends on the application. You take the test, you discover these are my strengths, and then oftentimes the advice is to only pursue work that aligns with those strengths. Okay, so then what does that actually produce over time? It's kind of like being around that kitchen table and saying, oh, you're the kid that's good at school, and you're the kid that's good at sports, and you're the kid that's good at art. And all you have to do is double down on that. It actually makes people quite fragile. And we think about generalists and specialists. It goes to the specialist side, but it really goes very deep into the specialist side, such that we kind of atrophy with regards to other parts of ourselves and things that we might be able to become. And similarly with passion, what we have seen is that we know that there are inequities in society that really set up who has opportunity to develop passion very early for, say, computers or for math or for these other, qualities and skills. And so when we look particularly in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, you'll see that if you ask boys at a certain age, 6 to 8 years old, what are you passionate about? A lot of them are going to say STEM. Why? Because they have been growing up for years with STEM toys and STEM cartoons and STEM this and STEM that, because we have associated STEM a lot of times with more masculine and boy identities. And so it doesn't mean that girls aren't passionate or couldn't be passionate about STEM, right? It's in fact that boys have developed their passion for STEM. So when we say, oh, you just have to know that this is like what you were made for, that covers up a lot of those histories and some of that structural inequality that has been built into our system. And so instead, if we want to have more people focusing on STEM for a STEM competitive global workforce, we're going to really need us to develop passion over time, to give people different opportunities, and then see whether or not it triggers some kind of passion, some kind of excitement as they're learning and developing it.
Yeah, and your company is working on equity, right? And so stereotypes, I mean, play a big role in this story because, I mean, the kind of stereotypes we normally talk about, male, female, different ethnicities and so forth. I mean, they just seem to be what you're describing just on a larger canvas because you can have these preconceived views of what you can and cannot do that are influenced by these social forces, or they could just be shaped by your parents, or have nothing to do. But does that mean that, I mean, on a societal level, we want to get rid of these preconceived stereotypes, but given that they're difficult to get rid of, I mean, does it mean that we should maybe kind of hold off on, I don't know, adopting these identities too quickly? Should we view ourselves as our identities as being something
More
more
malleable over
fluid?
time. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that you're exactly right that we've done this research in many different educational environments, organizational and business environments. And what we see, one of the most replicable findings that we have in the literature on this is that, these fixed mindset cultures, these cultures of genius, have a prototype of success. When we think about genius and you do a Google search and you put genius in and you look at the images that come up, who are the faces you see, Greg? Who do you think comes to mind?
Well, yeah. Well, I was gonna say some of the folks that you described, like, Adam Newman
Yeah.
and and
Yeah, exactly. You
and
see Adam
you know,
Newman, you might see Elon Musk, you might see Steve Jobs, you might see, certainly you'll see Einstein, pages of Einstein, because that in our culture is really associated with this idea of intelligence and genius. You might see Newton, but you can see what these individuals have in common, right? There are certain gender, a certain race, a certain ethnicity, a certain educational background and class background. And what that leaves out are people who, maybe women, people of color, people who have disabilities, many other identities, right? And so when we have these narrow, fixed mindset cultures of genius, what we know and what we've seen in the research is that people then use those prototypes to sometimes even unconsciously, without conscious bias, actually starting to match. Who are we going to recruit? Who are we going to evaluate positively? Who are we going to promote? And we start to look at the match between individuals and those cultural prototypes of genius, because in a culture of genius, you want to amass more geniuses in this environment. That's the goal, right? Stack ranking. We just want the people that match our very highest rankings. And in a culture of growth, It's much more diverse naturally. Why? Because it's not about matching to some narrow prototype of success that looks or feels a certain way. Instead, it's about who can grow the most, who can develop the most, who can pivot the most, who's overcome challenges. And when we look at our society and look at who has overcome challenges, who has actually had to pivot and try new things and overcome, these structural barriers, we see that that's a much more diverse group of people. And it's not just focused on any one identity. And so we see that in these cultures of growth, they attract, they retain, they promote, and they positively evaluate a much more wide variety of people.
Yeah, I found it kind of funny how Elizabeth Holmes, right, would adopt certain markers
Masculinity
of
markers,
genius,
right?
right?
And the black turtleneck and the deep voice.
Right?
That's
And just
right.
copy, Steve Jobs mannerisms. Yeah. It seems like, when you're a parent, I mean, I've talked to a lot of folks about parenting, and I don't understand why, parenting isn't something you can major in in
It should be,
college,
right? Seems
right?
important.
Because yeah, but it seems like okay, if you can't take a class in parenting, I mean, you can take classes in leadership, and there do seem to be some overlaps there, right? So at the family level, it seems like people's mindsets get formed and baked in the early family environment. What can families do to create sort of individuals that have the kind of growth mindset that might resist bad environments?
Yeah,
Because
it's a great question. How do you kind of arm or create some resilience around the fixed mindset or fixed mindset cultures, let's say, if they're going to go
well, I mean,
into?
you can't always choose where you work,
That's
right?
right.
So if
That's right. So, how do you hold on to that growth mindset? How do you inspire that inside? So, I think that you're right that very early on, how we set these things up are important. So, there's this one study that I want to share. It's Kyla Hamovitz and Carol Dweck who did it. And they brought kids and their parents into the lab, and they gave kids basically unsolvable problems and puzzles. And they had a video camera in there. They left the room and they said, okay, we're going to let the kid, play with this puzzle, and we'll be back in 3 or 4 minutes. And so they let them play, and they had a video camera watching what happened. And they had measured the parent's mindset beliefs. So did the parent endorse more fixed or growth mindset? And then they looked behaviorally at what the parent did when the kid was struggling with something that was clearly unsolvable. The parent didn't know it was unsolvable, but the kid was struggling because it was a difficult, unsolvable puzzle. And so some of the parents just took it away, and they tried to do it for them. They said, give me that before they get back in the room. Let me try and figure it out, right? Others kind of, every time the kid made a mistake with it, they would wince, or they'd show these nonverbal, like, I'm stressed for you, this kind of thing. Others were like really encouraging to the mistakes, like, oh, that didn't work. Let's try something new. Oh, that doesn't seem right. Like, what else could we try? And it was actually, which things actually predicted the kids' mindsets themselves? Was it what parents said they believe, or was it that behavior, that nonverbal or that verbal behavior that they were giving? It turns out that it's what we say and do that actually predicts our kids' mindsets, not just what we believe in our head. So we can believe that we have the strongest growth mindset, but actually subtly, when our kids are struggling, when they are making mistakes, how do we respond in those moments? And being able to focus on the verbal and nonverbal behavior, that's the stuff that actually predicts those kids' mindsets. Another practice I like around the table is, instead of just going around and talking about your wins or what went well today, talk about your favorite mistake. I love this favorite mistake practice. It's also one that people do in teams in the workplace. Today, my favorite mistake, I wore this white shirt and I got spaghetti all over the front, and that was really embarrassing, and whatever it might be. But talking about normalizing mistakes that we make, challenges that we have, and then as a family, we're going to figure out how to solve those or what we learned from them together. normalizing that and actually making it an opportunity for the whole family to come together, that's something on a daily basis. Sarah Blakely talks about that happened in her family. Other entrepreneurs and successful business leaders have talked about how early views of mistakes and as opportunities to learn and to grow really helped form that basis that allowed them to be resilient in the face of many rejections and challenges that they came up along the way.
Yeah, I love that story about Sarah Blakely, where I think the question was, how did you fail today?
That's
Right?
right. That's right.
You
And
know?
with that expectation that that's going to happen and I want to know about it. Right.
Yeah. And if you haven't failed, then,
You
you
haven't
did
tried
something
hard
wrong.
enough, right?
Right?
Exactly. Back to the effort.
But I mean, that means that there is an optimal amount of struggle, right? I mean, you talk about flow. I mean, obviously, you could have too much
Yerkes's
struggle.
Dodson's curve, right? Like thinking about like, where that stress level is, where the mistakes are, that's actually going to facilitate performance. And then there becomes a point at which it can really undermine performance. And so trying to find that sweet spot for each other and knowing that that sweet spot might change over time as we develop different kinds of expertise, we can push that curve over. So I think that that's really important to know too, that that's not just fixed for our whole lifetime, that it actually shifts based on our own current levels of mastery.
Yeah, and I'm guessing that within the corporation, it's the behaviors and incentives that matter more than the slogans. I mean, you said in the book that, people, they pay attention to the slogans and the mottos and the defining principles and so forth. But at the end of the day, I mean, there's not a perfect correlation. Oftentimes these are just, you
Words.
know, marketing. Yeah,
That's
it's
right.
marketing, right? Yeah.
That's right. These value implementation gaps are the things that really create cynicism within organizations. And so when we say we believe one thing, we say we're growth minded, we say growth mindset is what's going to get you ahead here. But then our performance evaluation is a stack ranking and bottom people, we don't have time to develop them, they're out. Or there's competition and the people who get all the praise and the promotions are the people who quote unquote have the best ideas. So they're competing against their own team to show that they're the star on the team. Okay, that is undermining this whole idea of the growth mindset. And so people pay attention, yes, to what the organization says, but almost the reason to pay attention to it is to understand whether it's true or not on the ground. And so when we have large value implementation gaps, we see more cynicism. We see people undermining the culture that is desired in those environments because they know what the ground truth is. And so what we want to do when we create culture is to find where those gaps are large and try to minimize them, bring our practices, our policies, our norms, our behaviors in line with the culture that we really want to create, because that's how we make the culture, true from the perspective of people within it.
Well, look, I think you have a very optimistic view of people. I think you're saying that anyway,
I do
everybody is
believe people can
capable.
change, Greg.
But I mean that has implications for recruiting and hiring, right? So, a lot of companies use personality tests on recruiting, and one of the things they look at is, openness as the part of the big five. And I think what you're saying is that, well, I mean, and a lot of people say that those personality traits are somewhat fixed. But I think what you're saying is that,
They're influenced by the
anybody,
environment.
yeah. And so, it's really more treatment than selection. And we can maybe hire just about anybody. And if we have the right culture, we can create the kind of growth mindset that we're looking for.
Yeah,
I mean, maybe it's
I
harder
would
for
say
some
that's
people than others.
yep. I would say that's a very strong view of kind of what I have seen work, both in the literature and then also in practice and organizations. I would say it's not that we can hire anyone. I do think that you have to have a base level of skills, ability, some kind of knowledge base of what it is you're doing. I think you have to have that as the base. And then the question is whether or not that level of skill, talent, ability is predictive over time. And I think that it gets you to a certain level of performance, but it doesn't get you the long term, the growth and development and the pivoting that almost everybody has to do if they're going to stay in their industry or stay in their job over time. And what predicts that to me is that growth minded perspective, so that you're willing to take risks, you're willing to take stretch assignments, you're willing to develop yourself over time. And I think that's what's most critical. If you don't have that and the baseline skills and abilities required of the work, I'm not sure you get the highest performing, outcomes that you really want to see.
Well, Mary, thanks so much for joining me. The book is called Cultures of Growth. Check it out. If you're a manager, if you're a teacher, if you're an employee, if you're a parent, right?
Yes,
Definitely worth the
yes.
read.
Thank you, Greg. This has been a lot of fun. Thanks so much.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.